Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Thank you. Okay. Good evening, everybody. And like the method we followed in the last live session, I would like to follow the same method in the sense that I will be happy if there are any inquiry, any question from the students, from participants, and we can begin with the questions, by responding to the questions. Before that, quickly, if I have to summarize or talk about the core idea of this course, which is about visual perception, and basically in this course, we have tried to see how visual perception and its various complex issues have actually informed the various kinds of art productions all over the world across various cultures. Now, the point here is complex, but at the same time, very simple. Complex because if we have to look at the phenomenon of visual perception from the scientific point of view, it involves a very complex process. Several scholars, scientists, experts in this field over more than 100 years, nearly 150 years, even more than that, have been trying to unpack the mystery of visual perception. Until this scholarly works happened, people generally understood visual perception as a very simple process that we look at the world around us and we gain a visual experience, in the sense that a process which involves our brain, our memory, our past experience, our biological wiring, etc. All together, they help us, they participate rather in creating the meaning out of what we see. Now, this has been a problem, a scientific problem, and has been addressed by hundreds of scientists over many, many years to, as I said, to break the ice, to unpack that mystery, and let us know how that whole process works. Now, from a cultural point of view, from an artistic point of view, for any artist, an art historian, an art critic, and anybody who is interested in the mystery of art making, realized that although people do talk about, scientists do talk about biological consistency, a scientific consistency with regard to visual perception, the way our brain makes meaning out of what we see. Despite all that, people realize that there is something more to it. Otherwise, if visual perception happens to be a universal and a consistent phenomenon, then why the art forms that we make happen to be so different, not only from one culture to another culture, but within one culture, from one time to another time, from one period to another period. Therefore, something very crucial has been observed here. That despite certain scientific and biological consistencies and universal observations, when we look at visual perception from cultural point of view, from creative point of view, then it is very clear that visual perception in the context of creative activity, in the context of visual creative activity, happens to be rather complex, because there involves a cultural interpretation, not just a biological interpretation. Now, if we look at it from a simpler point of view, if we try to make it less complicated and simple, then the scenario is like this. If we try to make a mental diagram of how it works, how it operates, how it takes place in the realm of a creative activity, then it is something like this. That yes, anybody who can see is able to visually respond to what one is looking at. From a tiniest object in this world to something close up, something in the distance, a whole scenario, one is also able to make out that there is right now a lot of light, or there is darkness, things like that. Very simple visual experiences that we go through every day. Now, this is generally believed by people who are not familiar with the history of art, particularly across different cultures, that an artist ideally should be representing or visually reconstructing what that artist is exactly looking at or seeing. If that is so, then why or how come? When we look at, for example, Egyptian art, the Egyptian figures, the way Egyptian figures have been drawn, look so different from the way human figures have been drawn on the walls of Ajanta caves in India, or the way a figure is drawn by a modern artist like Picasso, or the way a human figure is drawn by a Chinese or a Japanese artist elsewhere in this world. Now, there was a time, not anymore of course, when even scholars, art historians, used to think that in different cultures, artists, painters, they represented human forms or animal forms or any objects or even a scenario or a landscape in different ways because of the differences in the skill level. That artists in different cultures had different sets of skills, and therefore, if one culture, say for example, during late 15th, then 16th century and 17th century, Renaissance period in Europe, where we see artists coming up with realistically perfect representation of forms, human, animals, birds, architecture, trees, landscape. And that perfectionism in terms of proportion, anatomy, light and shade, volume, was so accurate to the real that it created an illusion of reality. Now, one of the very easy, not only easy, but an example that has been used widely and repeatedly is something like this. Let us look at, I'm just changing my background just to make you see the example that has been often chosen, not only by artists and art historians, but also by scientists, optical scientists, and scholars who have worked on visual perceptions, that we do know that the railway tracks, the two lines, run parallel to each other. In reality, they never meet, but either in reality or in photograph, or even if we have to draw to produce that sense of reality, we always show the way it is seen in this photograph, that the railway lines converge or meet at a point. Now, this is a very simple phenomenon. The roads meet, lines meet, etc. They meet visually. In reality, they never meet. Now, this very simple phenomenon became a very complex issue for experts from various fields who wanted to understand this phenomenon. And while people researched on this phenomenon, they came up with another very simple but an incredible and a mind-boggling kind of revelation. That, well, we know in terms of the real situation, we know that the lines actually never meet. But we see they meet. Therefore, the million-dollar question was, is there sometimes, at least, if not always, a fundamental contradiction between what we know and what we see? In one of my lectures in this course, I have also quoted from John Berger's famous book, which was actually preceded by a very, very famous BBC series called Ways of Seeing, where John Berger is drawing our attention to this very fact, to this very strange fact or a strange phenomenon, that it often happens that from knowledge we know something, but our visual experience tells us something else. Apart from this very common example of two parallel lines meeting each other. Now, parallel lines can't meet each other. Parallel lines would always run parallel to each other. Still, they do meet when we look at it. It is not something that we construct either through Photoshop It actually happens in real life. Similarly, we always say, look at our language, that sun rises, sun sets, as if sun is moving, sun is rising, sun is setting. But we know from our knowledge that sun is not moving. It is earth which is moving, which is rotating, which is revolving. And therefore, we experience that the sun is setting or sun is rising. We can come up with hundreds of such contradictions, examples of contradictions between our knowledge and our visual experience. So far, so good. Now, how, why, and when do this particular phenomenon of visual perception, with all its complexities and contradictions, have an impact on art making? Now, when we have looked at in this course various examples, whether from Chinese art or Japanese art, typically very realistic painting, or paintings which do not follow realism, but follow a mental imagination, in also child art, prehistoric art, primitive art, African art, tribal art, folk art of India. Through various examples, we have tried to not only explore how visual perception, once again, despite its, at least to some extent, biological and scientific consistency and universalism, visual perception happens to be, to some extent at least, culturally informed and culturally affected. There is a cultural component in visual perception which gets manifest in various art forms. And this is what we have been trying to explore throughout this course, with the help of examples of art, that is painting and sculpture, mostly across cultures, from different parts of the world and from different times. Now, I would like to know if there is any question, any inquiry, any curiosity on part of the students. And you may interact with me so we can go on with this live session. Instead of me talking or giving a monologue, which I have already given in that course, this is a very good opportunity that we have today to actually interact live. Let us take this opportunity. So there are no queries in the YouTube chat so far. If there is any query here on Zoom Live, I would be happy to respond.
Hello, sir.
Yes, please.
Sir, can you please talk about visual culture a bit? Like, how can we talk about visual culture and visual perception?
Okay. Let me take a few examples. Give me a moment. Okay, great. Let me take a few examples from the lecture number 8, that is the second week lecture. And let me share screen. Give me a moment. I hope you can see.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, we wanted to address a very important concept here, and an essential concept here as far as visual perception and visual culture or visual art is concerned. That is visual communication. Visual perception is a phenomenon that we all go through in our waking life. But the moment we talk about visual arts or visual culture, then visual communication, the idea of visual communication, the concept of visual communication has to be taken into consideration very seriously. And when we talk about visual communication in the context of either visual culture or visual arts or both, then instead of looking at art as independent productions or independent creative outputs, we have sometimes tried to look at art in the context of a larger cultural phenomenon. And in order to do that, if you remember, like we have done in this lecture, we chose, for example, folk art as one of the examples. Similarly, you can choose tribal art, you can choose Chinese art, Japanese art, where the visual cultural concept and the visual cultural environment and the visual cultural phenomenon plays a very crucial role in making visual perception a reality, making visual perception effective in the creation of art. Now, as I have said in my lecture, that in folk art, almost all over the world, we often find certain simplicity, directness, and clarity of forms. Now, it is interesting that, for example, when we look at this small little clay elephant, and when we find the form of the elephant is extremely simple, so simple that we may say that the elephant tends to lose. I mean, this little clay elephant is almost about to lose certain very important characteristic features of a real elephant. For example, the trunk is so short, even the ears doesn't look big enough, the eye looks pretty odd, etc., etc. Because we are trying to cross-check this small little clay elephant without the visual knowledge of the real elephant. So that is one way of looking at it. And then we find ourselves in a situation where we need to justify this small little elephant, which however looks beautiful, it looks cute and all that, but it never matches the robust presence of the real elephant. Now, here comes, at least in this context, in a particular way, the question of visual culture. Now, first of all, before we talk about visual culture, we need to also know, for example, the person or the person generally who would make this small little clay elephant or any other animal and birds, most of them actually know how these animals, birds, even human figures look like in real life. And they draw or sculpt in this way, not because they don't know how to do it, but because, let us go back to the communication factor, because they know that this simplistic form is good enough, adequate enough to communicate the idea of the elephant. This is very important because in a particular visual cultural environment, communication is extremely important. How? Because today we are looking at these objects and these paintings produced by the people of a particular culture. And we are looking at it from various parts of the world, right now from different parts of India. And if it is uploaded on internet, anybody can see from any part of the world. And therefore, we almost tend to forget that these artworks, be it a wall painting like you see here, or that little elephant, or these different kinds of rangoli, alpona, and all that, they were made, and they're still being made even today, primarily for the people of their own culture. So why this is important? It is important to know that within the given visual culture, this is from Madhya Pradesh, now it is Chhattisgarh, where tribal people go and place these terracotta horses under a tree in the distant jungle, in the deep forest, and they come back to their villages, never to go back to that area, maybe for next 4 or 5 years. Even if they do go back, they hardly look at these terracotta horses, which you see in this photograph, and these horses which we would love to buy from Emporium, from Delhi Hut, or from folk art fair happening anywhere in this country. So when we buy, we need to remember, okay, we love it, we like it, we would love to keep and collect a few of such terracotta horses in my drawing room. But primarily, it was not meant for me, in the sense that when we are talking about the communication was happening within that given visual culture, which accepted unanimously the form, the specific simplicity of the form, and also it accepted the fact that these terracotta horses were made not as art objects, but as an act of devotion. They are also known as votive horses. Votive, as an act of devotion to be placed under the tree and submitted to their idea of God. So the communication is basically happening, conceptually speaking, between these people and God. Now, the criteria we often try to apply or impose upon them is different. Something that we have learned from our colleges, something that we have learned from our urban educational upbringing, and therefore there is a clash. So visual culture refers to put it simply, number one, that in a given culture, particularly we should be looking at the visual culture of the rural communities, the tribal communities, certain traditional communities. I'll talk about urban visual culture slightly later, but right now I'm talking about those communities, those cultures which have a very strong tradition of their own. Therefore, certain visual communications, visual forms, visual ideas are socially shared. It is already shared. It is like a language. Whether A looks like A or A should look like B is not a question that has to be entertained. The car should look like car, gar should look like bus. And what makes car look like a car and a gar looks like a gar? What makes P looks like a P or M looks like a M has been established once and for all. There is no issue here. Similarly, in traditional visual cultures, what makes a horse look like a horse? What makes, for example, the turban that you see on the wooden sculpture of this man perfectly looks like a turban to the extent it equals the real turban worn by the real man who is actually making this murti, this figure. All these things are already accepted within the given visual culture, who would never use the criteria whether it looks like realistic or not. Everything is real to them. Realistic figure does not necessarily have to be for them something like it should have accurate proportion or anatomy, things like that. Because unanimously they belong to a shared visual communication. Very satisfactory. So visual culture in the context of traditional societies, in the context of folk, rural, tribal societies, actually refer to these shared ideas, and their environment plays a very important role. Their upbringing plays a very important role. What do they encounter and fight with in their daily life? All these things play a very important role. And also their customs, rituals, the religious practice, all these activities become the part of the larger visual culture we are talking about. Now, in case of an urban scenario, of course, I can't claim, nobody can claim that there is a widely shared visual communication, because in a typically urban, modern cultural scenario, people are pretty independent of each other. Yet, the way technology-driven communication is happening these days, we have no problem these days to read an emoji on our WhatsApp message. Again, it has been already shared. The meaning has been established. When I send a smiley emoji with a smiling face, nobody would think that I am sending a sad face. So it is not true that visual culture, in terms of a shared experience and acceptance, exists only in traditional and rural societies. Now we can see that it is existing also in urban, modern society. I mean, look at, for example, the publicity images, advertisement images. Hundreds and thousands of people in a typical urban scenario in any metro city looking at the same advertisements, the same billboards, the same publicity images, and they are receiving the same meaning, the same content. Not that all publicity images are very realistic. They all follow their own pattern, their own design, their own motives, their own visual vocabulary. So I wonder what makes all the thousands and thousands of people, for example, living in a big city like Kolkata or Delhi or Chennai, they interpret the meaning of advertisement or a publicity boarding exactly the same way, all of them together. So when we go back to this image once again and get back to the meaning of visual culture in the context of the traditional communities, this apparent simplicity in folk art, now we realize, is actually informed with a close inspection and involvement with life. Like the way we read a text, a script, be it English or Hindi or Bangla, whatever. Similarly, we also read an image. And this image reading, if it happens to be a very shared activity, so I can rely on a form which is functionally also useful, that I don't have to go to the details. I also don't have time. I have to do things very quickly. And this simplicity is not simple, but it is a part of a viable communication with the rest of my people in that same village or in that same community. Yeah, we have seen all these things. So even today, this is not a very traditional piece of clay sculpture. It's relatively new, made by a few years back by a young boy from a village next to my place. And he claims that this figure actually are supposed to represent a Bollywood actor. Now, I didn't find anything very special about it. There were other children sitting around him. And the boy who made it, he claimed that this is a figure of Akshay Kumar. I said, what is so Akshay Kumar about it? I don't find anything very special, which will help me to identify that this figure as Akshay Kumar. But interestingly, although I challenged him, the other boys, the young boys, there were few girls also from the same community, they were like furious at me. They thought, why can't you see it? He's Akshay Kumar. Then they were trying to point out certain things. No, this looks like Akshay Kumar. This is the way he stands, etc., etc. So once again, I realized that psychologically, mentally, they have already invested, collectively, they have invested the image of a very specific person into this figure, and therefore, they see what they want to see. So visual culture is actually a very, very complex phenomenon. And it differs from one place to another place. For example, when I first saw this image, and I thought, oh my God, this lady has such a scary expression. And I actually bought this piece of small little artwork. I would say artwork, they would say no, it's a doll, whatever it is. It's a three-dimensional sculpture made in not just pure clay, rags, paper mache, all mixed up. And the lady who made it, she laughed at me. She's from a village in Bihar. She laughed at me. She said, what? You see scary face? This is an expression of a very loving mother. So then I again realized it is my cultural limitation, constraints. So why I say visual culture, why we keep using the term visual culture? Because it is only through art that we realize that visual phenomenon, let me repeat, maybe biologically there are some universal consistencies. But culturally, the way we generate a meaning out of a face it is really very different from one to another. And therefore, these experiences have taught me to see visual culture as a cultural phenomenon. Had not been so, I would not have felt as my first reaction when I saw this piece that the face of the lady is so scary. But actually, for her, the lady who made it and her community, this was not a scary face. This was a very loving, the face of a very loving, compassionate mother who is busy in her daily course. I can give you another example from, for example, let me just open. If you remember, in one of our courses, we looked at African art, right? Now I can show you, say for example, this one.
Can I ask a question now?
Please.
Sir, actually, I am a professor from Madurai Tyagaraja School of Management.
Sorry.
I am professor, Tyagaraja School of Management, Madurai. I am teaching data visualization. Hello,
sir.
So my question is, currently, for example, the printing industry, they are using a concept called CMYK.
Right.
And electronics industry, they are using RGB.
Right.
So since we are discussing about visual culture, visual perception, right, what are the techniques the tribal art or the rural art they are used? Something similar to, because these are all the technologies, RGB, CMY and all. So earlier, particularly in the tribal art, what type of techniques they used for the coloring?
Thank you, sir. Well, as far as the coloring is concerned, as we all know, in most of the tribal communities, they depend on the locally available organic color sources. For example, they produce colors from the various stones, which we all call earth color, or from various sources like plants, leaves, and flower petals. That is vegetal colors. Vegetable colors, earth colors, and that now has been adopted by many urban artists also, and they call it eco-friendly colors, organic colors. Now, this use of organic color without any chemical component has been in use in almost all over the world for thousands of years. So, technically speaking, as far as the traditional tribal and folk communities are concerned and their paintings are concerned, they always went for these kind of organic colors, and they usually, you would see, they usually go for very straightforward color palette, right? For example, red, green, we don't see much use of blue, yellow, earth colors, and sometimes black. What is interesting, since there is no RGB and CMYK and all that, I mean, to them, all these ideas were not available. So therefore, it is just by, number one, changing the juxtapositions, altering the juxtaposition. Even if you look at our traditional Rangoli, if you look at, for example, kolam, which is mainly monochromatic, but you can also see, I have seen some little later modern Muggu and some of the kolams, then Rangoli, then in Bihar, Aripona, and then Alpona in Bengal. Wherever they don't go for bright colors, but wherever they do, they use the colors in a very minimalistic way, very limited color palette. When they do the wall paintings, there they have to apply a little more color in terms of his variation and range, but they make it a point that, first of all, colors don't overlap. Usually, you do not find any tonal application of color in any tribal art. Colors are used in their raw identity. Red is red, yellow is yellow. They will never mix red and yellow tonally. If they mix, it will become orange. They can use orange. There is no tonal gradation. Then, technically speaking, as far as visual perception is concerned, they often alter the juxtaposition of colors. That is the spatial juxtaposition. So, by using extremely limited range of color palette, they can produce or evoke a sense of multiple colors in our mind. This is what I had once asked a cultural anthropologist who has done tremendous work in many tribal villages and communities in India. And that professor has particularly looked at the color, the use of color in various communities. And I came to know from him that they have an inborn capacity, an ability to produce the effect of multiple colors by actually using very, very minimum number of colors. So in terms of the hands-on technique, there isn't much to talk about. But in terms of this mental perception, the ability to understand, which is inbuilt, not that anybody will be able to explain as far as these tribal artists are concerned. They won't be able to explain that how it is happening, but they know. They know very well from their experience of several hundreds of years that by altering the juxtapositions, by altering the space components, making it large or small, changing the spatial relationships between the various colors, they can create or produce the effect of many, many colors which are not even there in the painting. So therefore, when we as students used to read in many books that compared to modern art, in tribal art, we see limited colors. This statement is true, but at the same time, it is an incomplete and misleading statement. It is true that they do use a limited number of colors, but the statement is incomplete because usually the early scholars never told us that by using limited colors, they can, and they did, and they still can do, produce the effect of hundreds of colors. Now here, much later, somebody pointed out, and I myself, from my own experience, I have seen that, I have cross-checked that when we look at a painting, suppose we are looking at a modern art by Picasso or anybody, we just look at that painting, either on screen or if we go to the museum on the wall. For a tribal person, when they are looking at a painting painted on the wall, for them, all the visual elements outside the painting, including the trees, the sky, the roof of the house, and the ground, everything also becomes, all these things become part of that painting. At least if I say, look, most of these wall paintings, like the famous wall paintings of, let us say, Worli in Maharashtra, none of them will have even an inch of blue color. Now, if I say this to one of those Worli painters who is doing that painting on the wall, I'm sure he is going to challenge my perception. I'm sure he's going to tell me, you don't see blue here? I said, of course not. It's all brown and white, sometimes a little bit of black. He said, what about the sky? Now to think the sky should also be considered, that is the blue of the sky, the part of the painting, which it is not, is an idea that we are not accustomed to. is an idea that we usually do not follow, but they do. So if I say the blue is missing in your painting, they will point, we will draw my attention to the sky and say, what? There is a lot of blue in the sky. And if I tell him, but that blue is not a part of painting, they will ask me, who told you? Of course, it is a part of the larger painting or my larger visual perception. And that is part of visual culture. And it is not an idea of that particular man who has painted that worldly painting. It is an idea shared by that entire village, who everybody thinks that even that blue color of the sky becomes a part of my visual experience when I'm looking at a painting, which is actually painted only on the wall. Now, quickly, when I look at a three-dimensional form like this, which is an African sculpture, a kind of mask, and when we describe this kind of mask, usually we say, this is how you will find written in books, that we see, okay, a simplistic kind of nose, that is also fine. Nose in itself is little protruding, but in reality, but the eyes are protruding. Then the mouth, the lips are exaggerated. I mean, look at the words we use. But if you talk to an African person, not only the person who has made it, but anybody in his community, that why have you made your eyes projected outside the face or too much protruding? Is it what protruding? We haven't protruded the eyes. There is no such projection. I can see that. Then he will tell me that, look, this is an expression of eye. This is not the eye itself. What expression? Because this mask belongs to, ideally, it actually represents the ancestors. And the ancestors in many of these African communities are supposed to be staring at you, looking at your life, taking care of you, protecting you. And the why? Then the mouth is so projected. First of all, in many African communities, if you look at their physiognomy, many of them do have very thick lips. But this is even more than that, because these ancestors, they constantly send you, according to their belief, good vibes, good mantra, good wishes through their mouth. So it is only when we know the meanings of these features and how do they function in the conceptual framework, then it becomes a part of the visual culture, which doesn't have any problem in reading these features in a very, very natural way. They don't say that these are protruding eyes. They will not say, looking at a wall painting, that the painting doesn't have blue. If painting doesn't have, but the sky has. This is what I had to respond. Anything else? Okay, yes, the examination for this course is on 23rd of April. As far as the examination tips is concerned, I would like to once again insist that please go through the video lectures and the PowerPoint images once again, and listen to some of the observations that I have tried to share with you. Listen to some of the information as far as the scientific explanation of visual perception is concerned. There are even names of some experts and scientists who made a real difference to our understanding of visual perception. There are names of art historians like John Bircher. So remember some of these names. Remember some of the phenomenon that we have discussed. Everything is there in these video lectures. All the questions that you will be asked to respond to or write, be it objective or subjective, everything can be answered if you have seen the video lectures carefully and listen to the facts and informations, and B, the interpretations, the understandings I tried to share. This is all that I have to say.
Sir, can we close now, sir? It's
Yes,
5 o'clock.
Murli,
And,
if it is
there are no questions. Yes, ma'am. Sir, just hold on, sir. Lalti ma'am is here. She wants
okay,
to.
okay. Thanks.
Hello, Shomikda.
Hello, hello. How are
How are
you?
you? I'm fine. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Amaditya, we have 2 more courses again, July te.
Which courses?
Murli will let you know the course title.
No, have we decided on the course titles finally?
Did we?
I think some courses are added, ma'am. I'll just check and.
Okay.
IIT Madras has been added.
Okay, thank you so much.
ठीक है.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Shomikda.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable time.
Thank you, Murli, for your help.
Yes, sir. No.
You have been a lot of.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Right, sir. It's a wonderful live session, sir.